Hello, everyone. My name is Austin Ouma, and today I'm going to be taking you through the process of mounting a storage bucket as a file system in OCI. The use case here will be a scenario where you have a very large export dump file on premise, and you'd like to do an import onto a DBCS instance on OCI. To explain this, the process normally is a scenario where, say, for example, in this instance, you can see you have an on-premise database, and using the database export utility, you get a dump file, okay? And then that dump file, based on the size, can be moved directly onto the file system of your DB node, okay? Or it could be copied to your object storage. Size is actually what will determine where you are able to actually copy this dump file. So what are the limitations that I'm talking about? Okay. So in this instance, this is a database system that I created, just to showcase what we want to do. So we will be trying to move a very large file onto this database instance. But then if you look at the mount points that we have available, so if I do a df-h, of course, you'll be aware that most of these file systems are reserved for specific users, so we cannot just use any file system. But by default, for the DBCS instance, we always have this U01 file system, which is where you have your database binaries, your files, and things like that. Ideally, this is where you would actually decide to move your dump file. If you look at the size that we have here, it basically tells you that the maximum available size for this instance would be around 196 GB. So that basically means that if you have a dump file on-prem that you'd like to move on to OCI, ideally you'd be looking at a scenario where the dump file is less than the amount of storage that you see here. So we're thinking about 180 GB going downwards. Okay, so in that instance, as I mentioned before, the first thing for you to do would be to just create a mount point, a file system, a folder in this U01 mount point. And then, you can copy your files there, point your import utility to that directory, and boom, you're ready to go. It's the fastest way to actually do your import. Okay? But say in a scenario where you have a very large dump file that cannot fit into this U01 file system, what then would you be able to do? So say you're talking about a dump file that is around 1 terabyte or 2 terabytes or even 500 gigabytes. The thing is, at the end of the day, your dump file is larger than the available storage that you have here. Then what do you do? And this is where object storage comes in. So the scenario that I'm going to showcase here is that you can actually create a storage bucket, okay, and then mount that bucket as a file system on your DB node. Now, we all know that the storage bucket allows you to store virtually an unlimited amount of data, which will be able to open up the space for you to store a very large dump file. For example, as I mentioned, anything larger than 200 gigabytes. So if you have like a terabyte, 10 terabytes, or whatever it is that you're looking to import into a database cloud DBCS instance, then you are going to actually use object storage. Okay, so how do we do that? Let me show you. So as I mentioned, there are two prerequisites that we need for this demo. We need, first of all, to have our Oracle database. And because it normally takes a long time to provision this database, about an hour or so, I pre-created one before we started. And I may just show you what we have available here. So I've created a DBCS instance called TestDB. Okay, and in this DBCS instance, we have our database that is called TestDB. Because it's just been created shortly, there's still a backup in progress, but that does not stop us doing the demo that we are going to show. And then, of course, in addition to the database, we also have the DB node. Okay, so this is where we'll be logging in to basically execute most of the functions around this demo. Okay, so we have this DB node with the public IP, as you can see there, and the database node is actually called TestDB as well. Okay, so that's the first prerequisite, which is having the database available. The next thing that we need to have is the object storage itself. So remember, we've already ascertained that we cannot copy our very large dump file directly onto the file system. Okay, so what are we going to do? We are going to copy that dump file or whatever file in this instance we are just showcasing onto an object storage bucket. So the other prerequisite that we need to have is a storage bucket. So what I'm going to do is to create a bucket. And let us call this bucket, what's the name we are going to give this bucket? Let me just see. I think let's call this bucket bucket file system or something. Anyway, so let's just call it a bucket FS. Okay, and we click create, and that's it. So all we need to take note of is the name of the bucket. So we have bucket FS, and then we take a note of the namespace. Okay, and the namespace is that. And then we also can see that we're operating from the Frankfurt region. With that in mind, I think we are ready to proceed. We have our database instance running, and we also have our storage bucket set up. So we will be simulating a scenario where we are copying a file into this storage bucket, okay, into this bucket. So with that in mind, let us go to our prompt, and we can continue from there. So this is the file system that I was referring to on the DB node that I just showed you on OCI. And you remember we already said that we are in a scenario where we cannot copy our file onto U01 because probably it's larger than what is available here. So we've already created a storage bucket. I think we called it bucket FS. And we will be mounting that bucket onto this DB node as a file system. Now, before we do that, there is a utility or a tool that we need to install onto this DB node, okay? And that utility is what is going to be used, you know, to actually showcase how we are going to mount this. So before I do that, let me just load it quickly. Okay, so as I mentioned, the first thing we are going to install is what we call the S3 FS fuse utility, okay? S3FS fuse utility, file system user space. Okay, this is the tool that we are going to actually use to, you know, mount our storage bucket onto this DB node as a file system. And the command to basically do that is what you see there. So we are just going to be installing S3FS fuse, okay? Now, these may not work by default because of some safety guards built into our DB/CS node. And what we need to do is basically to disable the version lock that has been set up on our system. Okay, so what we need to do is to get into the versionlock.conf file and then change a parameter there enabled from 1 to 0. That basically allows us to be able to install the repos that are necessary for us to install S3FS. Okay, so what I'm going to do is to pause this here just so that it finishes, and then we'll continue from there. Okay. So as you can see, as I was saying earlier, we were not able to do this installation because of the version lock that has been set. And this is why we have an error. So S3FS was not installed. But what we need to do to be able to do that is to actually configure our file lock, okay? So what I'm going to do is to execute this command. Let me just erase that. And then let me paste that command here. So this is actually the file system that we are going to reconfigure. Okay, so you get onto that file, and then what we need to do is to actually switch this enabled parameter from 1 to a 0. Okay, so that enables us to be able to, you know, install the repos that are necessary for S3FS. And so what I do is I save this file. And once I save that file, there is a couple of, we need to actually set up the repos first for us to be able to install S3FS. So what I'll do is to execute this command. So we are getting into OL7.repo, which is our operating system here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually add in a couple of lines into this file, which will basically allow us to install S3FS, okay? So what I need to do is to edit this file, okay? And how do I do that? And insert mode, and then I paste the following lines, okay? So I've just edited and added these lines for OL7, our instance here, and we have the EPL for the addition of our repos here. So these are the two lines that we basically add, and then we can actually save this file. And once we save this file, we can attempt to run our, to install our S3FS again. So let me execute that and let's see. Okay, so it seems like there is an install going on. So we will wait for this. So let me pause this. Yes, it looks like it's going on. Let me pause this because it takes a little bit while, and then I will resume. Actually, we are done. So there is no need for pause. So you can see that S3FS was being installed here. You can see that it is installing all the dependencies. And at the end of the day, what we need to look out for is this last line, which basically tells us that we completed and the installation was successful. So that basically shows us that S3FS has been installed. Remember, this is the tool that we're actually going to use to mount our storage bucket onto this node as a file system. With that done, we are ready to go into the next step, okay? Okay, so the next thing for us to do is to create a set of keys that we are going to use with the S3FS to basically mount our object storage bucket onto that DB node. And for us to do that, I have to get to my profile. So the profile, the user that is actually logged on at the moment. So that is myself, Austin. And so what I do is I log on to this profile. I go to the profile prompt and screen. And then under resources here, I scroll down and you can see customer secret keys. Okay, so we are going to generate a secret key here. Probably what I may do at this point in time is to delete this key so that I recreate it afresh so that you're able to see what I'm doing. So let me create a key. Let me call it mount key. Okay. And then what happens is that when you generate that secret key, we need to actually copy the contents here. So you can show the key that has been generated. And then let me copy it onto some notepad because I will need that key later on. Okay. So I have my secret key stored. Okay. And then I can close this. And then when you generate the secret key, please note that an access key is also generated for you. Now, these are two separate and different keys. We have the secret key and then we have the access key. Okay, so we need a combination of these two to create a password file that we will assign to our S3FS tool to mount our object storage bucket. So just like I copied my secret key, I will also copy my access key. Okay, paste it again onto my onto a notepad somewhere. And then this is what I will use to actually generate my password file. So once we've generated those two keys, I think the next thing that we need to do is get back to our prompt where we were connected to our DB instance and create our password file. Okay, so I will just go back to my prompt. And this is it. I'm back to my prompt. Okay. Now, what I need to do is to create a password file, as I mentioned, using the two keys that we just generated on the OCI console, the secret key and the access key, okay? So what I need to do is to execute this command. So I'm just creating a password file here, and that's the name. And then in this password file, as I mentioned before, I'm going to enter in this format, the access key, okay, full colon, and the secret key. Okay, so you just copy the access key and the secret keys. Okay, so let us go back to where we copied our access key. So remember, it's the access key first, okay, which is what we have here. Sorry, must have been logged out. So let me just log back in. Okay, so as I mentioned, we are creating our password file. Let me just get that again. So we are creating our password file. So I'll just execute this command here. And I think it's looking at it as a scenario. I already had one file created. So because that's why we were logged out in the middle of creating this file. So I'm just going to abort this and make sure that I create it afresh, okay? So that we actually get our password file created. So just allow me to correct that. Okay, so we are back here. So as I mentioned, we need to first copy our access key, sorry. We need to copy our access key onto our password file. Okay, so there we go. And then we copy our secret key. Okay, so remember the syntax is access key, full colon, and then we copy our secret key. Okay, so let me copy that here. And that's it. So this is basically the syntax. So this is what we have here. So we have our access key, full colon, and our secret key. Okay, and then what I do is I can save this file. Remember, this is the password file that we were creating earlier, and you can see that's the name of our password file, okay? So that's it. You can check the availability of the file, and we can see that it is available here. Okay, so with that done, the next thing that we are going to do is to actually change the access mode of our file. And basically what we are going to do is to just execute this command. So it's going to be a 600. Okay, so we are going to change the mode for the password file, okay, to 600 for accessibility. Having done that, the next thing that we now want to do is to mount the object storage bucket. So remember, we had created a bucket called bucket-fs. But before we can mount that storage bucket, we have to create a mount point. We have to create a file system within our file here, okay, within our DB node. So again, I do my df-h, and this is what we see. We still do not have any object storage or any new file system created here. So we are going to create a file system, okay? And I think what we are going to do for the purpose of this demo is just to create it under our home directory. So I'm going to create a file system called test bucket in our home directory. Okay, so this is it. So I'm just creating a directory, home OPC, and we are calling that folder or file test folder test bucket. So our object storage bucket is going to be mounted onto this file system, okay, in our home. You could also create this under U01 or wherever you actually want to create it. Okay, so I've created my file system, and then what I want to do is to actually mount the object storage that we had created earlier, okay, the object storage bucket called bucket.fs using S3FS tool. And we will be actually using this command to actually mount. So we already have all the ingredients necessary for us to do this. So what we are going to do is to actually mount that storage bucket into the file system that we just created. So how do we do that? We actually just run this command. Sorry, let me just get it again. 1 second. So we run this S3FS command. Okay. And this is actually what we are going to execute. But before I actually execute it, so we are using sudo rights to actually execute this command. Remember, this is S3FS that we had actually just installed. This is the first bit. And then what we are doing is that we want to mount this bucket. So the bucket name comes next. So remember, we called our bucket -fs. And then we want to mount it onto this file system that we just created, home OPC test. Okay, and then the endpoint basically just shows the region that we are working in, and then it will need a password file. Okay, the password file is the password file that we created earlier using our access key and the secret key. And then there is this URL that actually points to your namespace, which hosts your bucket, okay? So remember, we figured out that the namespace for our storage bucket is what we have here. Everything else remains as it is in the syntax. So you will have compat.object storage as well as your region that you're working in. So this could be actually Frankfurt or it could be London, depending on whatever region that you're working in. But at the end of the day, the syntax basically is you're running S3FS and then you're running bucketfs, and then, you're mounting your bucketfs bucket onto this file system, and then you run the command. Once you run the command, if you see no error and you're taken directly to the next prompt, then it means that your command has actually run successfully. Okay, so this time, if I do another df-h, then we should be able to see our file system that we created here mounted here. Okay, so we are able to see our file system, and you can see that S3FS is what is running here. Okay, so one way to test if this mount point is actually working on storage on the bucket that we created, we could test by just creating a sample file on our file system here and checking on object storage bucket through the OCI console if you are able to see the same file that we've created on the file system. Okay, so I'm just going to create one file. So we are calling it OPC and then test bucket. And then let's create a file, test file, .txt, for example. Okay, so we've created a file. We can cd where are we? Let me check where we are. We are in OPC. If we ls, we'll see our test bucket. I can seed into that test bucket. And then if I ls, if I ls -l, let me list what is available. We can see the file that I just created. It's an empty file. It's just an example for us to check if the mount point is actually working. So we should be able to see this test file.txt file on our storage bucket using the OCI console. So let me go back to my console. So I'm back on my OCI console, and what I need to do is to go to buckets, and then let me check what was the bucket that we created? Bucketfs. So let's open Bucketfs, and if we scroll down, we should be able to see the file that we just created on our DB node terminal, which is testfile.txt. So that basically tells you that using the file system on the DB node, we can create files that can be visible on our object storage. The other test that we could do is to directly say load an object or a file onto our bucket and be able to see and test and see if we are able to see that on our file system. So let me just pick something from my machine. Let's say a file called, I have another text file. It's called tv.txt. Let me upload that file. It's a very small file and it's finished uploading. And you can see that we now have two text files, one that we created in the file system and one that we've just uploaded onto object storage. Now, if we go back to our terminal and we do an ls, we should be able to see the tv.txt file available on that mounted point, okay? So let's go back to our terminal. So here we are back on our terminal connected onto our DB node. And if I do an ls, boom, we can see the file that we've just uploaded onto our storage bucket available on our mounted file system on this machine. So this would actually be a dump file, for example. So if in a scenario where we had a dump file that is larger, remember this is now object storage, mounted as a file system. And because object storage allows for unlimited, virtually an unlimited, availability in terms of storage, you can just copy or upload your files, your dump files as normal. This time they can't be larger than 200 GB. They could be 500 GB, 1 terabyte, 2 terabytes, 10 terabytes, 30 terabytes. And once you've uploaded your dump files onto that storage bucket, using your S3FS, if you did an ls, you will be able to see all those files listed there. So, ladies and gentlemen, that was just a very short demo to show you how to mount an object storage bucket onto file system on your DB node, should you need to do that. So thank you very much. I hope that was valuable and you'll find a use for this in future. Thank you very much and have a good day.